Welcome to Dejope. The Ho-Chunk have called Dejope, or Four Lakes, home for time immemorial. The story of the Ho-Chunk and the Wisconsin Indian nations offer insight into the complex outcomes of colonization and settlement of North America. Wisconsin is often seen as a laboratory for federal Indian policy and its outcomes for American Indian peoples. American Indians in Wisconsin have led the way in reshaping the future for American Indian peoples. We can see this story through the university facilities, as they've been developed over time with campus. Join us today as we understand Dejope and the shores of Lake Mendota in new and powerful ways.
The UW-Madison campus is unique in the world in that it has more archaeological sites and more effigy mounds than any other university that we know of in the world. The cultural landscape covers a 12,000-year period of human occupation in this area. We're interested in how people have used these places along the lake and interpreting that for the campus community.
Our stories speak to those times. So those histories are here, the stories of how we lived, the environments we lived in, the plants that we used, the animals whose areas we shared. That's all in our creation stories and origin stories and migration stories as well.
People have a general misconception that the Western Great Lakes region was removed from the processes of European contact and colonization that began really with the Spanish in the late 15th century and early 16th century across the Caribbean.
One of the great myths of European American settlement in America is that they arrived in a wilderness, that they came to a place where no one had lived and that they alone shaped the landscape. But that's quite far from reality, because over a 12,000-year period, Native American people lived here, hunted here, shaped the landscape.
Well, the written history may begin in 1848 for this institution, but the history of the native peoples of this area began thousands, tens of thousands of years ago.
European Americans have known about the existence of mounds for at least 150 years, but our understanding and our ability to interpret what those mounds mean has evolved over that time. Initially, people thought that the mounds were built by some lost civilization. It was so difficult for them to understand that the native peoples in this area would have the skills and the engineering abilities to create these inscriptions on the landscape.
There are 562 federally recognized American Indian and Alaska Native nations today, speaking 210 languages. The 12 Wisconsin Indian nations have a relationship with the state government here in Wisconsin, but more importantly, a federal relationship. When the Northwest Territory becomes part of the United States after the American Revolutionary War, 3 to 5 states emerge in the Great Lakes, including Wisconsin. Although we often focus on Wisconsin Indian history, the relationship between the federal government and the Indian nations exists prior to the formation of the United States. And that federal relationship today is the backbone of the survival of American Indian nations, their language, customs, and sovereignty.
Independence of the United States created a subsequent process of ultimately dispossession for the vast majority of the region's native populations, ultimately creating the conditions for Euro-American settlement throughout the upper Mississippi region. The early American Republic, despite its contemporary status, was in fact very weak and divided. So to enshrine a stronger centralized federal government, the framers of the American Constitution specifically included the supremacy of the federal government over Indian affairs in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. That process becomes one of enormous, often sacrifice and loss for Indian peoples who are ceding away millions of acres of their homelands to the federal government.
The period from 1880 to 1920 marks a historic low for American Indian peoples. Of the approximately 6 million American Indians who inhabited North America prior to European arrival, we are down to 237,000 survivors of disease, warfare, and colonization outcomes. The United States must wrestle with what to do with the survivors of colonization. One aspect is extermination, the other is self-determination, and the last is assimilation. The United States decides on assimilation as the #1 vehicle to help American Indians evolve into the mainstream society of the United States. This comes with complicated outcomes, and it sets the stage for the self-determination of the 1970s.
The process of settlement often brought with it a very high level of expectation on behalf of the territorial and then later state leaders that the Native communities would ultimately adapt and adopt many of the requisite forms of life that the Euro-American communities are bringing with them. That means manners of dress, manners of speech, manners of being that are ultimately often at odds with many of these communities' primary traditions and behaviors.
There were lots of removals and lots of things happening during the time that the campus was formed, and the governor Henry Dodge and Governor Doty, and all of those experiences that happened back then with the people that were here. We still have Ho-Chunk people that are in Winnebago, Nebraska, and I have relatives that are there. And so with all of the removals that have happened, I think the important thing is that we are still here.
So those processes of particularly adaptation, but also adoption or forced adoption or assimilation brought harrowing loss and difficulty to many communities who saw, as we all know, many of their children taken from them and sent away to boarding schools, who saw the imposition of foreign economies and political structures for them, and just a kind of chaotic and profound sense of unfamiliarity in their homelands with the kind of changing circumstances around them.
Welcome to Bascom Hill. The origins of the University of Wisconsin Madison are in the Morrill Act, the land grant status of our institution. The land is acquired after the Ho-Chunk cede 10 million acres to the federal government and the evolution of Wisconsin from territory to statehood. North Hall and Bascom Hall are now historic land features that are preserved and can't be torn down or altered in any significant form. North Hall and Bascom Hall are also built on top of effigy mounds, and the cultural erasure of American Indians and Alaska Natives in the Great Lakes is tied into the development of our campus. Ultimately, 14 mounds are destroyed under university facilities.
This was recognized tens of thousands of years ago, as evidenced by all these sacred ceremonial remnants that we see in the form of mounds and artifacts and such. And so, the fact that they were bulldozed breaks my heart, and it seems like such a loss. In Western terms, it would have been like, destroying the Mona Lisa or the Pietà or, some great work of art. These were works of cultural art that told the people that saw them the worldview of the people who created them. But on the positive side, there were those visionaries like Charles Martin of the State Historical Society who, in some cases laid down in front of the bulldozers to prevent their destruction. So there were those people that recognized them for what they were. And the fact that they were associated with an academic institution like UW-Madison is not surprising.
Right here on Library Square Mall, in the 1880s until the late 1920s, the UW student body used to engage in something called the Pipe of Peace ceremony, central to their sense of accomplishment as students at our university. The Pipe of Peace ceremony originates with the American Indian and Alaska Native peoples participating in this ceremony, but by the time of the Pipe of Peace closed in the late 1920s, it has devolved into what is called a burlesque. The Pipe of Peace ceremony was so central to the student fabric that when they created the main social space of the university, the Memorial Union, they incorporated the pipe into the crest of the Union, where you can still see it today, commemorating that relationship, or at least awareness of American Indian peoples in the Four Lakes area prior to the creation of the university.
There is a very deep desire historically speaking, within the American kind of popular and cultural consciousness more broadly, to pay tribute on some level to the continent's original indigenous populations, particularly in moments of extreme modernization and technological change that is kind of bewildering the nation as a whole. It's no coincidence. You see the rise of very kind of classically Western Americana kind of themes of individualism and kind of naturalization, many of which take all kinds of forms. So on the one hand, one wants to recognize that kind of desire to commemorate the original peoples of the continent, but on the other, one has to be troubled by how simplistic and reified these images become, because you can't simultaneously pay tribute and commemorate another culture if you don't allow space for that culture or those communities to actually participate in that dialogue.
In front of the Social Science Building is this plaque commemorating Blackhawk of the Sauk peoples. Although technically what we consider Illinois state history today, the removal of Blackhawk from his ancestral homelands to west of the Mississippi actually illuminates a larger process of Indian removal that impacts 60 Indian nations. President Andrew Jackson puts into law the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and removes 60 Indian nations from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. Locally, this impacts the Ho-Chunk Nation, who endure 40 years of removal before reaching a state of accommodation with the citizens of Wisconsin, learning to live side by side with Wisconsinites until present times today.
And this kind of early sentiment to commemorate Blackhawk's presence here in Wisconsin and here on our campus is in many ways more about those communities than it is about Blackhawk's experiences themselves. Because those experiences are ultimately very harrowing and traumatic and require contextualization within not just the war itself or the conflict, but his earlier years and the whole history of this region that many of us really don't encounter in any kind of sophisticated form. It's a very kind of one-sided and simplistic, and one might say kind of racialized process where you're constructing a sense of self, ultimately, what this institution means by projecting a sense of other. I mean, I think we'd all be well served with a deeper understanding of Blackhawk and his time and place, rather than a singular chapter out of his ultimately unsuccessful efforts to resettle in his ancestors' homelands.
The renewal of American Indian languages, cultures, and customs, often called the American Indian Renaissance, coincides with the civil rights era of American history. July 9th, 1970 marks the formal end of assimilation and termination as federal Indian policy. Up until this time period, the United States is actively working to destroy American Indian language, cultures, customs, and worldviews. The self-determination era has American Indian educators, activists, and lawyers using the frameworks of the United States to advocate for American Indian issues and needs. And in this time period, we see legislation protecting American Indian languages and natural heritage.
Those contrasts are really under-recognized forms of American achievement that really all Americans would be well served understanding. The literally poorest of the poor, the most marginal, economically challenged communities on the American continent, North American continent, have, some of them have overcome generations of harrowing impoverishment, political subordination, religious persecution, and various forms of other kind of marginalization to become not only active, but in many ways leading contributors of their regional and even national economies.
Extermination, relocation, assimilation, self-determination, and neglect. And then in the 60s, you see this, sort of romanticism and nostalgia that all of a sudden it's cool to be Native American, and Marlon Brando at the Oscars, and everybody's wearing beads and headbands, and the identity of Native people suddenly is adopted by the mainstream. And, everything's okay for a while, but as these outsiders try to understand our culture, all of a sudden there are these really complex concepts like sovereignty and self-determination and community, sustainability, sustainable development. And these are concepts that are really different from Western concepts of government and business and capitalism.
And so back then, there was a lot of a spotlight on the national scene of American Indians and American Indian movement, and we were just in the shadows at that time trying to bring courses to campus and doing it in an academic way rather than a confrontational, militant action type of organization. We were just trying to make a start and trying to make it more academic and get recognition for our student organization and for American Indian Studies. So we saw the value, and we were hoping that administrators would also see the value and that we could recruit more people so we didn't have to do this alone.
American Indian Studies has been part of the University of Wisconsin Madison since 1972. Currently housed here in Ingram Hall, American Indian Studies is a great place to learn about contemporary and historical American Indian languages and cultures. American Indian Study also plays a crucial role in the revitalization of American Indian languages and the understanding of what it means to be a contemporary American Indian person with sovereignty and all the powers that come with it.
My first year on campus was probably the most challenging, just coming here, being born and raised on a reservation, coming here and not really seeing anyone who I felt like I could connect with. I didn't feel that, I didn't even see anyone who looked like me. More people lived in my one tower of the double tower dorm than the community I grew up in, and so that was a little scary at first.
I see us as survivors. It's difficult to come from, a place where everyone is like you. You feel like you can relate to them, to all of a sudden coming to an environment where you're amongst very few. And, there's definitely the culture shock, but I think also too, there's a challenge to always feeling like you need to defend your identity, to explain who you are, why your culture is the way it is, and it's always a struggle, a daily struggle, even in the classroom.
But I think that once I got involved and in community organizations and student organizations, campus organizations, that's when I really started to feel that sense of belonging and investment, and that I actually had a place here on campus, working towards creating a community that all people could probably feel that they belong to.
To be able to, I think, successfully navigate your way through the university system, get your degree, is such a great accomplishment, because not only are you trying to, make the grades and, retain your schedule, work your jobs, not only doing the fundamental things, but you're also doing these other broader social tasks of, trying to create awareness, trying to, make your presence felt here on campus, and trying to, fit into a diverse campus is really, really hard to do.
More and more American Indians and Alaska Natives are accessing higher education, but it still comes with much challenge. From 1946 until 1976, 33 American Indians graduated from the University of Wisconsin Madison at all levels, graduate, undergraduate, and professional. From 1977 until 2006, 779 American Indian or Alaska Native peoples graduated from institution, a radical shift in the presence in the campus culture. Even though the numbers are increasing, the challenges still remain critical.
What I think is key for this university as it moves forward in its relationship with Native people is to understand that it's people, not buildings, and not processes, not institutions, that hold promise for the future. We need to keep the ideas flowing. We need to integrate Native students and professors into the plan as the University of Wisconsin moves forward, while at the same time understanding and respecting their cultural distinctiveness and not try to assimilate them into the mainstream. And so, I'm really excited because there have always been visionaries associated with this university. And I'm really excited about what the future holds.
We're definitely living in a really unprecedented chapter, era, or epoch of American Indian history that is so distinctive from all of its preceding chapters. It would seem to be that these communities will require really highly skilled, educated, and competent administrators, technical and educational workers who both can maintain these communities' systems within this framework of unprecedented government-to-government relations, but also how these communities will then also maintain their own kind of cultural, linguistic, and religious and/or spiritual connections to their own homelands.
As a Board of Curators member, I was able to work with Ho-Chunk Nation and help in establishing the H.H. Bennett History Center in Wisconsin Dells that has a lot of photographs of the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk people in their collections. So it would be nice one day to have that same kind of story told about the Madison area plus the UW campus, if there could be some kind of collaboration where we would see the history of the lands in this area, the blending of those things that we have that we value, the green space, the water, the land, the people, the cultures, the heritage, and I'd like to see more of that being prominent.
I think in terms of Indian country in general, I would want people to know that we're really diverse. We're diverse within ourselves, within the Native community. It's not just Native American. There's 500 plus nations within that are all very diverse in terms of language, culture, and tradition. I definitely do see a lot of that back home still, racial tensions between Native and non-Native students. But I definitely feel that, coming through UW, I've have a better understanding of not only myself, but those around me. And I would hope that I could take these skills that I learn here and continue those kinds of dialogues, increasing understanding and tolerance back home. I think that would be helpful. Or at least helping to create the systems or, the services that might help create that environment.
The University of Wisconsin Madison should be a flagship for the study of at least the upper Mississippi and Great Lakes regions and Native communities. It should have a highly diversified academic staff. It should have a highly diversified faculty. It should have a highly diversified professional and graduate student population. And obviously it should have, perhaps most pressingly, a highly diversified undergraduate constituency.
Well, I definitely think there's a connection between American Indian people and the land. That is our home, that is something that we respect and cherish. And so I think it's really important that the university makes the efforts to preserve those notable landmarks. And I think that not only does it show that the university has a respect for American Indian people that are here, but just the simple fact of acknowledging that there was an American Indian presence here long before the institution was even built. And I think that really allows for people to have a sense of pride and for them to retain a sense of that history here, and also to promote that awareness to other non-American Indian people that are here on campus.
A key component of that diversified campus community should be representation from at least the Wisconsin nations, as well as other American Indians who reside in the state of Wisconsin. Given the fact that some of the most powerful and politically and economically important Indian nations in the country reside here in the state of Wisconsin, should be a strong impetus for the campus community to embrace a vision of its future involving, to some extent, these resident and historically First Nations communities here in the state.
I definitely feel a strong sense of attachment to here, Wisconsin. The Ojibwe people call this place home. I feel obligated to have a greater investment in a lot, because this is home to a lot of Native people, Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, you know, Menominee, Potawatomi, but that I feel obligated that I should have that investment because this is home. This is always going to be home, and I should help in shaping for future generations.
The 21st century holds much promise for American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. Our ancestors engaged in complex treaty-making processes, made huge sacrifices both personally and as sovereign nations, so that the generations that followed them would have the opportunity to thrive in modern American culture. It's exciting with the advances of education, law, and health that American Indians now find themselves in a stable position that we haven't seen since the close of the 19th century. This shared future we have together as both Indian and non-Indian alike has much positive effect for all of us in the future. Thank you.